Welcome, everyone, to the Q&A session for our upcoming course, Unlock Your Epigenetics, the 6-week journey to optimize your gene expression for vibrant health and longevity. I'm Lisa Bunnies, and I am so excited to be hosting this Q&A conversation for the Shift Network, where we'll explore the teachings of Dr. Kenneth Pelletier and address questions about his upcoming 6-week course, Unlock Your Epigenetics, which begins Wednesday, August 21st. Later, I'll explain how you can participate in this course, even if you can't attend the live sessions. But first, I want to introduce our guest. Dr. Kenneth Pelletier is a clinical professor of medicine at the UCSF School of Medicine and a former clinical professor of medicine at the Stanford School of Medicine. He's also chairman of the American Health Association and is a vice president with American Specialty Health. Dr. Pelletier has authored numerous books, including the international bestsellers Mind is Healer, Mind is Slayer, and Change Your Genes, Change Your Life. He's a peer reviewer for several medical journals, including the Journal of Occupational and Environmental Medicine, and he serves on a number of corporate boards. He's published over 300 professional articles and has appeared on ABC, CBS, CNN, NBC, and the BBC to discuss his research. And in just a few minutes, we're going to open up for your questions, but first, I want to bring Ken Pelletier onto the line. Welcome, Ken. It is so good to have you here today.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here, and thank you for the invitation.
As I mentioned, I'm really excited to talk about this. We have the rest of our time together to dive into our viewers' questions as we prepare for the upcoming course. Again, that's called Unlock Your Epigenetics, and it begins Wednesday, August 21st. If you want to check out the website and learn more about the 6-week course, you can visit unlockyourepigenetics.com to see the full description. But before we get into the actual Q&A segment of our time together, let's talk about the focus of your work. We, meaning the general public, have sort of been taught to think of DNA testing as just a tool for disease prediction or treatment or even genealogy research. However, your emphasis is instead on healthy biomarkers, which takes us in a whole new direction. So I'm hoping you could talk a little bit about this to help us shift our focus that way.
Yeah, thank you. What you raise a very important question and distinction. I think the greatest misconception that people have and medical and researchers and professionals have is that DNA is like the hard drive on your computer, that it's an invariant set of laws that regulate everything that occurs in your body the way the hard drive does on your computer. And that's a very biological, reductionistic, deterministic model, and that underlies what I've characterized as the disease prediction model. You submit your information, and then you get a prediction that 40% likelihood of some dreaded disease. And there are many problems with that approach. The most common example is 23andMe. You have a 40% likelihood of some condition, the 10 that they diagnose. The problem with that is that it doesn't tell you anything about what you can do to change that. It tells you nothing about the 60% of people who have the same genetic profile who do not develop that disease. And also it's statistical. It's mathematical probabilities. It doesn't tell you anything about you. It's based on large data tables and percentages and projections, has very little, honestly, if anything, to do with your real risk, but most importantly, doesn't tell you anything about what to do about it. So that's the disease prediction model. If you take the same genetic technology that's used in disease prediction and apply it in a different direction, and that direction is the one my research has gone, and it's really the future, is called healthy biomarkers. So someone might say, well, what's a biomarker? An example is cholesterol. So if we were having this conversation 10 years ago, I would guess most of your listeners would not know their cholesterol. Today, I'd guess that almost all of you do know your cholesterol. So that's a biomarker. It's a number applied to a biological function in the body. And there's a range, there's an optimal range. So if you're too high in cholesterol, that's an obvious risk for heart disease. If you're too low, that's the risk factor for cancer. So you want to be in this optimal range. That's what I mean by healthy biomarkers. So everything in the body, everything that's governed by genetics, every aspect of our blood, every aspect of our intestinal tract, all has a biomarker. And what we do is we look at the optimal levels of these, and more importantly, we'll tell you what you can do about it. I mean, it's one thing to be said you're too high or too low. To me, the most significant question is what then? What do you do about it? And that's what we'll be looking at in the course. And I think what you've raised is a critical question in this whole field.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to diving into this. So let's go ahead and get started with our viewers' questions because they've got a lot of them waiting for you. If you
Sure.
have a question for Ken, go ahead and type it in, and I'll be happy to read them aloud. In the meantime, let me ask the question that has come in more often. This is an FAQ here. People are asking, so what about those who are already living with chronic illness? Can learning about their DNA help them on their path to wellness?
Short answer is yes. It's never too late to slow down a disease trajectory. Sometimes it's too far advanced to fully reverse it or go into remission. Let's be clear about that. But at any stage, at any age of any chronic disease, you can have a profound influence on whether it becomes debilitating and worse or proceeds more rapidly or slowly. So you do have a considerable measure. Now, the obvious thing is that the sooner you start. So if you have a condition at age 40 and you know it has genetic biomarkers that you can regulate, you're probably going to have greater success at preventing the manifesting of that disease altogether or reversing it. There is disease reversal. Than if you were 70 years old and had the same biomarkers for the same disease. Well, it's been in your body, it's been expressed so long, it's going to make it more difficult to totally resolve it. But again, you can slow it down. There are also ways of adapting to disease. I think most people have already a chronic disease, one or more. But there are healthy ways to live with disease. And in one of my books, I entitled a chapter, Break Through, Not Break Down. And very often people have a disease, and when they recover, they actually are better than ever because they've had insights and support, and they've made lifestyle changes that has made their overall quality of life better because of the disease. So there's a healthy way to have a disease, I guess is the short way of saying it. And at any age, any time, we can have an impact.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. Um, Here's a question from Marlo who wants to know what's the current state of awareness in the mainstream medical establishment in understanding epigenetics in healthcare?
Well, that's a good question. Depends, I guess, on who you ask. I mean, epigenetics is a very solid scientific discipline. It's been around for at least 10 or 12 years. So it's not new, but I think what to practitioners, to predominantly physicians and other clinicians, nutritionists, chiropractors, naturopaths, et cetera. So it's not a completely new discipline. It's received a lot of attention lately because of, I think the most obvious example is the CRISPR editing of the Chinese twins, where a geneticist in China altered the genetic profile of two unborn twins to prevent the receptor sites for HIV from being manifest in them once they were born. And the controversy is still raging, and there are pluses and minuses to that. But that's raised the awareness in the medical community of the power of genetics and especially of epigenetics. So I think the acceptance is much higher, that it is a scientific reality. The problem is we don't have any training. We don't know how to interpret the results. We don't even know how to administer the results, much less interpret them. So when you have even a new test, it doesn't matter if it's in genetics or radiology or biochemistry. When you have a new test that clinicians are not sure how to interpret that and what it means for an individual patient, they'll be very conservative, and rightfully so, and just not do it. Also, there's a high level of knowledge and interest. You're not going to find it in practice commonly right now, but you will within the next few years. I mean, certainly 5 years from now, it'll be a completely well integrated, insurance reimbursed aspect of care. And now you get literally, 10 or 20 publications a week, if not more, in this area. So it's rapidly growing in its information, and therefore the professional awareness of it is fortunately growing as well.
Okay, great. Now, since we're talking about tests, we do have people asking about the testing for the course. As you and I were talking before we started here, there are so many DNA tests out there. Which do you recommend specifically for this course, for the information that you're going to be working with, and why did you choose the specific tests that you're talking about?
Well, your listeners are asking very good questions. Let me start out with the broader picture, which is I'm sure almost everyone that's on this call, I certainly get maybe a dozen new startup companies promising some aspect of genetic testing, making very bold, comprehensive changes, and testing. We're going to give you your whole genome and make all of these disease predictions for you, down to specifics about, we're going to tell you about your breast cancer risk. And so those are it's like blizzards, like snowflake in a blizzard. And I get those flooding my email, and I'm sure everyone does. So the call has gone out. It's science based, but again, it's not so much getting the data, is what does it mean? How to interpret it? What's it got to do with me? What do I do about the information? That's really the critical question. And also accuracy is a big issue. So when I look out at the startup companies, and they're all startup companies, there are virtually no what we would consider to be well-established companies doing genetic testing at this point. So when I looked at the roughly 20 to 25 startups that have a reasonable knowledge base, make reasonable claims, I narrowed that down to about 10, a top 10, if you will. And then from that really came down to about 5. And we could talk about the names of those 5, but the one that I chose for this course is called Day 2. And Day 2, DAYTWO, and oh, by the way, just segue, but I don't have any financial interest, compensation, remuneration of any kind from any of these genetic companies, including Day 2. So my opinions or assessments are really as a scientist looking at the database and the accuracy of the predictions and the claims is really a foundation in science in their claims. So using that as the test, and we are developing in our research an assay that will, I think, be the most comprehensive, but we can talk about that in a bit. But Day 2 was developed out of the Weizmann Institute in Israel. And the Weizmann Institute is one of the world's great nutrition research centers in the world. And a group of scientists there 10 years ago actually developed this assay. And they probably have genetic profiles now on about a third of the total population of Israel. And now Israel is a small country, but that's still a lot of people. And about a year ago, they decided they would enter the United States, and they now are a startup here in San Francisco and about to enter the United States. And when I say enter the United States, what Day 2 does is sample from the gastrointestinal tract. Now, that may sound esoteric, but it's really the organ system that extends from your mouth to your anus. And in that system, there are anywhere between 40 and 100 trillion cells, microbes, viruses, bacteria, 40 to 100 trillion. Now, in the human body, there are only about 23,000 genes, so you get an order of magnitude. And what day two does, and it's just a little more detail than maybe your listeners need, but there's the human DNA that you get from most of your genetic assays. There is your genetic profile. But then there's what's called environmental DNA. So it's the DNA of the bacteria that are on or in your body. And at least for dietary purposes, what you really want to know is the environmental DNA. You want to know what the bacteria and what your intestinal tract is capable of digesting, absorbing, managing for your own high-level nutrition. So day two is focused on the environmental assay for your intestinal tract. Great science. They've got publications in Cell, which is one of the main genetic journals, professional journals. They published an article, I believe, in January, February of this year in Journal of the American Medical Association on a long-term study they did looking at, is this a persistent effect when people follow their guidelines? Does this persist? The answer is yes. And again, we can talk about detail, but it showed that yes, you really can make changes. They're actually doing a 1-year follow-up now that has been submitted to JAMA. So it's a very good, solid, scientifically based company. The information is accurate. They send all of the assays back to Israel, which may sound extreme, but one of the issues in the genetic testing world is lab error. And we've done research here where we'll take a blood sample of ours, send it out to the different labs, get the assays back, freeze our blood sample, and send the same sample 3 months later. And all I can tell you is what comes back is not the same as what you got back the first time. It's errors. Sometimes it's contradictory. Sometimes you think your DNA has been mixed up with someone else because it's so different. So lab error is a real problem, and it's a problem with every single genetic testing company. Day two has tried to minimize that by having the same lab with same high standards at the Weizmann Institute doing the testing. So when you get back your profile, it's very accurate, science-based, and again, I think it's of the 5 that are out there, it's certainly the top 1 or 2, and again, that's why I recommended that particular one for this course.
Wow, that you just blew my mind. That's fascinating. And this actually sort of leads into another frequently asked questions. People are asking, because you talked in your conversation with Stephen, the intro call, about how you'll be using the information from this testing to tweak the diet. How does that work? People are really curious about that.
Okay, well, my observation in cardiology, because coming from cardiology, is that we all hear about the miracle diet, right? I mean, probably the only thing I get more often than a claim from a genetic startup company is about the diet of the day club. I mean, my God, I go to a conference and you hear about high fat, low fat, paleo, ketogenic. Most recently, I was at a conference and they were touting the celery fasting diet, juice diets, fasting, intermittent fasting, 1 day a week, 1 day a month, 3 days a month. I mean, it's just this blizzard of recommendations on diet. And in fact, my publisher always jokes. They say, Ken, what you need to do is write a diet book. And I said, well, about what? And they said, doesn't matter. Pick anything. The sweet cherry diet, and pick a condition that you think will have an impact on it and publish it. It'll be a bestseller. So there's just this overwhelming amount of information. I've got one slide that I use that goes back to the mid-1980s, and it's a series of 10 covers of Time magazine that featured whatever the particular dietary fad was as the cure-all for whatever condition it was talking about. So 10 covers, the 1980s on Time magazine on best diet. And So I contrast that with the fact that about a year and a half ago, the Journal of the American Medical Association took 10 diets and that are very popular and very well known. And they looked at the outcomes at 6 months. And they said, do people lose weight, improve their health based on these diets at objective measures at 6 months? The answer was yes. And it was yes to every single diet. So every single diet was positive, had a desirable impact. Then they asked, what did those diets look like at 1 year? At 1 year, every single person on every one of the diets, didn't matter what it was, were all back to their prior weight, call it regression to the mean. So they'd all gained back the weight they'd lost at 6 months. Now, there are a number, well, one diet showed stability, meaning the weight that was lost was maintained at 1 year. And it's always a surprise to me, but it was Weight Watchers. Now, honestly, Weight Watchers is not nutritionally a terrific diet. I mean, it's not organic. There's a lot of additives. There are a lot of problems which could be solved for Weight Watchers, but so far they have not. But that was the only one. And the reason was not so much the nutritional value or how much better the diet was than the other 9, but it has a built-in support system. People talk to each other. You get your foods prepared. You can get your foods delivered. So dieting is easy. You don't have to worry about maintaining an extreme diet like restricting carbohydrate intake or eating high-fat foods only like on a ketogenic diet. But to me, the most important factor was one that they missed in the analysis, which is people paying attention to your diet. So if today, doesn't matter to anyone listening, if you decided, I'm going to do diet X, does not matter what that diet is. If you pay attention to eating for the next 6 months, you will lose weight and you will feel better and your health will improve. It literally, according to the JAMA study, it doesn't matter which diet you choose. So I step back from all of this array and this barrage of very often contradictory information. I mean, high fat versus low fat is totally contradictory. High carb versus low carb, again, totally contradictory. And ask not what is the best diet in terms of a guideline, because guidelines, again, they're statistical. They're made for large numbers of people. They really don't fit anyone very well. It's like if you bought a suit or a dress and you didn't have it tailored, well, it doesn't fit very well. And that's the same with guidelines. So the question for me becomes not what is the best diet, it's what is the best diet for you, for you. Most of us don't know because we can't know. We don't know enough about our intestinal tract, about our own biology, about our own digestion. The way to do that is through these genetic assays, because the genetic assays get very specific. They will say, eat walnuts, not almonds. Genetically, you're not predisposed to eating almonds. You are genetically better suited to eating walnuts. Now, that's a degree of specificity. So the whole idea, this is again a bit of a long-winded background, but the idea of the course is not to change your diet, not to change your diet. It's to tweak the diet you already have, to make small adaptive changes that overall will improve your health. And there's a great one of the studies from day 2 demonstrated they compared 4 different diets for pre-diabetics compared to a day 2 guideline that was developed for individuals. It turned out at the end of 3 months, the people in the day 2 diet had lost between 8 and 12 pounds, sustained weight loss. None of the other diets showed weight loss at all. And it was interesting because the objective of the day 2 tweaking of the diet is not to lose weight. It's not a weight loss program at all. And yet it happens. So again, it was by adapting the diet to your own biology that you end up creating the best diet for you. And that's the objective.
Okay, great. And then let's take this into another direction here, because I know that you're into the whole mind-body
Yes.
aspects of health. We've got a question here. This is an anonymous one. It says, what do you think about those of us who are highly sensitive choosing diets based on what we feel and detect what works best for our body?
Well, we can fool ourselves. I mean, an obvious thing would be if you ate a lot of white sugar. White sugar is lethal toxin. It's horrible. No nutritive value, raises blood sugar, leads to pancreatic exhaustion, is on the path leading to pre-diabetic and diabetic type 2 diabetes. So white sugar is just lethal. So if you ate a lot of white sugar, probably in about 15 or 20 minutes, you would feel jacked up. You'd feel energy, you'd feel high, you'd be mentally alert, you'd be sharp for all of about a half hour to 45 minutes till your pancreas caught on, and then you'd go into a crash when you excrete a high amount of insulin. So in that sense, you could be sensitive to a very high amount of sugar intake or alcohol or drug intake. Methadone as an example, methadone would be an example. The problem is, again, we can fool ourselves. So let me get another example of a study. This is a kind of a trick question. What do you think would spike your blood sugar more, a banana or an Oreo cookie? Now, most people say, of course, it's an Oreo cookie. And for most people, that is true. However, for about 20 to 30% of people that are tested using genetic assays, the banana spikes their blood sugar more than an Oreo cookie. Now, that makes no sense, quite honestly. I mean, I'd like to be in the Oreo cookie category. I'm not. Unfortunately, I spike on an Oreo cookie. So you can't always know by any intellectual process what's good for you or not. Another good example is white rice versus brown rice. If I ask you which is better in terms of digestion and least likely to spike blood sugar, brown rice or white rice, almost everyone says, oh, brown rice is much healthier. Again, not true. About 20% of people consuming an equal quantity of brown or white rice will have a spike with brown rice and not with white rice. So we can fool ourselves by thinking we're always self-selecting the best diet. I mean, when I've taken these assays, and I do all of these myself before using them with any patients or making any recommendations, I learned some things that for me were really quite surprising about my diet, to which I've paid attention for many, many years. So we need objective assays to really keep us on track and give us good, reliable information, I guess would be my answer to a very good question.
Okay, thank you for that. And for those of you who are just joining us, we're here with Dr. Ken Pelletier, learning about his upcoming course, Unlock Your Epigenetics, which begins Wednesday, August 21st. And you can log on to unlockyourepigenetics.com for all the details and to register. So let's get back to the questions. They're rolling in here. Since we're talking about the body-mind connection, that's what the last question was about. What Stephanie wants to know, she says, I'm interested to learn more about how my beliefs and thoughts influence my DNA, my health, and other practical ways that I can increase my well-being.
Yeah, that's a very important question, and one that I think for most people is the most elusive. I mean, somehow intuitively we understand that diet will impact our genetic profile. It's not so obvious how our thoughts and beliefs do that. The major negative mechanism between our thoughts and beliefs and genetics is in stress. When we change the biochemistry of our bodies and we're under extreme prolonged stress, that has a direct, measurable negative impact on your genes. And that's very clear, and we've known that for probably 50 or 60 years. So there's not a great deal that's new about that, except for the fact that now we have genetic assays that can show us literally. I mean, these changes that we're talking about take place in seconds and minutes. The longest duration it takes to completely alter your genetic expression is 10 to 12 weeks. So if you started today to change something about your diet or your stress level or environmental exposure or physical activity, you would be transformed in 10 to 12 weeks, maximum time. So the stress is one where it happens virtually instantaneously. So if you think about the gene is at the core of a cell. The cell is in the biochemistry of your body. And when you're under stress, you completely alter the biochemistry of your body. And there are two different kinds of stress, which again, more detailed than we need right now, but we get into that in the course and how to differentiate them and change one to the other. But what we're now learning is the impact of positive emotions that have a measurable effect on genetic expression. So there are many examples, but a couple of examples. There was a study at Harvard published in the last year that followed a group of, I believe, 20 some odd meditators and compared it to a group of non-meditators over a period of 10 to 12 weeks. What they found at the end of the 10 to 12 weeks is that the genetic expression, the optimal biomarkers for the genetics for the meditation group had all improved. So you got reduced inflammation, you got better lipid metabolism, you got all of your genetic profiles had improved after 10 to 12 weeks. With the control group, it stayed the same, basically same level as they started with. So then some smart graduate student said, well, if it takes 10 to 12 weeks and these things supposedly change in a matter of seconds and minutes, how rapidly could that change take place? So he did a study with 15 minutes of meditation with adept meditators versus non-meditators and measured their epigenetic profile before and after 15 minutes of meditation. What he found is that after only 15 minutes, all of the epigenetic markers improved. Now that to me is astounding. That tells you that your thoughts, your inner beings, your beliefs, your practices have a direct, positive, measurable impact on epigenetic expression. So now it doesn't mean that if you meditate once for 15 minutes, all is well. The point is, and I think we'll see that in the course and in the epigenetic profile, is that you need to sustain. So whatever changes you make, if you tweak your diet, if you tweak your stress management technique or physical activity or environmental exposure or connection to friends, it's another influence at the subtle level. Friends can be good medicine, and it does work that way, that these they all have to be sustained over time. So the changes are not, the joke is, I've quit smoking 10 times. Well, the reality is most people do attempt to quit smoking 10 times. It's the sustained change of behavior that we're after, and that's what can come out of these assays and the guidance that it gives us, because you can retest, and this isn't like, oh, let's retest in 6 months. I think maybe once a year to see how are we doing, like checking blood pressure or any other variable. It keeps you on track, and that's the challenge in the positive emotions and their impact on our genes, which is to stay on track, stay positive, keep moving forward.
Okay, great. Wow, once again, fascinating stuff. And this leads to a question here that's from Catherine, since we're talking about stress, et cetera. She's asking, what about so-called mental health issues like anxiety, depression, and even ADHD? Can they be either helped or prevented by learning about our DNA? And if so, how?
That's a very good question and really points in the direction of kind of a subset of epigenetic research, which is the epigenetics of psychological states or psychiatric conditions. Short answer is yes. A colleague of mine, in fact, we're doing a dialogue, I think, tomorrow morning as part of the marketing, if you will, or advertising of this course, is a Dr. Emmerin Mayer, who's chairman of gastroenterology at UCLA. And I think he's written a book, I think it's called The Brain-Gut Connection. But the whole idea there is that there's an intimate connection between the gastrointestinal tract and the physical brain. So the most receptor sites that are common to the intestinal tract that are in the brain. So the brain and intestinal tract are an intimate interaction, intimate communication, largely through the vagus nerve, but they are intertwined inseparably. So when you talk about mental states like ADHD or anxiety or depression, there are interventions, nutritional interventions that can have a profound positive impact on changing the serotonin and dopamine and other neurotransmitter levels in the brain. So this whole area of nutritional based personalized interventions for mental health is a subset, and it's the research is new. It's not a huge number of publications yet, but it is growing, and it's very clear there is an interaction. So the mental states, so if a person is depressed or is suffering from ADHD or post-traumatic stress disorder, that has a direct negative impact on the intestinal tract, which cycles back to the brain and increases the difficulty or the problem. On the other hand, if you change your diet, if you see the modification of your intestinal tract that can change the biochemistry in your brain, and you do that, it will have a positive, alleviating effect on these conditions. So again, this mind-body interaction that really is the basis for my research going back to 1977 is becoming more sophisticated in the area of epigenetics.
Okay, great. Then let's take this in another direction too. I love the way this is just sort of leading us down this winding path. What about then? People are asking about inflammation, autoimmune reactions, that type of thing. Is that the kind of thing that, again, doing the genetic testing, the DNA testing can help to tweak, to improve?
Yeah, absolutely. Inflammation is one of the areas that basically the microbiome or the intestinal tract analysis can really be very effective in detecting and also giving you ways. I mean, there are foods that modify inflammation. So the things that increase inflammation are red meat, processed meats, poultry, sugars, alcohol, refined carbohydrates. I mean, those are pro-inflammatory. They will increase your inflammation markedly so. Things that decrease inflammation are fresh fruits, vegetables, fish. So blueberries, as an example, is a very powerful anti-inflammatory fruit. I mean, it's almost one of those superfoods if you think about it. So inflammation is really the basis for much of what we think of as current chronic disease. So all of the arthritic disorders, irritable bowel syndrome, heart disease is an inflammatory disorder. You get high markers for inflammation. Is honestly one of the easiest things to detect and one of the easiest things to modify. That's kind of the good news. And the inflammatory markers are very clear. Some markers are not so evident, but those particular ones, CRP as an example, C-reactive protein, which is an inflammatory marker for heart disease, is very clear and very quite easy to modify. So that's, if you will, the good news in terms of inflammation. Now, just as a caveat, I've seen genetic tests which basically say we're going to detect inflammation and show you, or basically tell you what you can do to lower it. Well, you really don't want to get rid of inflammation. It's not a negative function. When we look at healthy biomarkers, what you want is an optimal, adequate level of inflammation. So excess inflammation does lead to all of the conditions we're talking about, and it is mostly dietary driven. It's also driven by stress. When you're under stress, you have a high inflammatory response globally throughout your whole body. Your joints, your vascular system, your heart, your brain, your gut is all highly inflamed. But if you go too low, if you don't have adequate inflammation, then you're subject to things like flus and colds and viruses, autoimmune diseases. So think about it, if you get a little cut on your hand, that reddening around the cut, that's a pro-inflammatory response. It's your body's white cells going in to try to heal and prevent that from being infected. You want that to happen. You don't want to curb that. So as with all the optimal biomarkers, again, that's what we'll be looking at, which is what are your optimal range of biomarkers? You want adequate inflammation so your immune system is strong, fending off viruses and colds and flus and autoimmune diseases, but you don't want it elevated to where you're getting into trouble with other conditions. So it's this range that is easy to detect and easy to maintain. So I hope that kind of addresses this issue. But inflammation is a huge subject, and in particular, the day 2 assay is very good at detecting that and would give you very specific dietary guidelines on which foods to avoid or which foods to combine. Again, sidebar. The assay doesn't necessarily say avoid anything for that matter. What it will say is that if you're eating a food that creates inflammation, here's a food that counters it. So eat them at the same time. And what you'll get is a nice curve. And the last thing I'll say about this is why the emphasis on blood spiking or glycogen spikes in the blood. Well, it's a great marker for overall strain on the body. It's a great marker for overall health because when you eat something, when you're under stress, when you have an environmental exposure, if you get a glycogen spike in your blood, your pancreas has to respond to that. And it does so by excreting insulin. The insulin creates a trough, and you get this kind of roller coaster effect in your whole body's chemistry. If you do that on occasion, there's really no problem. And I'm not saying eliminate all the foods that we really like by any means. But when you go on that roller coaster again and again, every meal, every day, weeks and months on end, basically you create pancreatic exhaustion. The pancreatic exhaustion leads to pre-diabetic syndromes, insulin resistance, and eventually it will actually lead to prediabetes, ultimately to type 2 diabetes. So we're looking early on in that causal chain at inflammation and saying, okay, how do we create optimal stress response, optimal diet, optimal physical activity, optimal environmental exposure so that we do not go down that slippery slope. We maintain an optimal range for all of our biological functions for our entire life. Because we not only influence the quality of our life, we're largely talking about the quality of life and quality of health, we actually directly influence the length of our life expectancy. Now, that's not something most people take as obvious about epigenetics, but there is an entire field of epigenetics focused on life extension, and it works. It's a very powerful influence on the quantity of life that we will end up living.
Wow. Again, blowing my mind. I'm not going to have a back of my head before the end of this conversation is over. And looking at the clock here, though, we have time for plenty more questions, folks, so hang tight. But before we take those, I want to give a few details about the course itself because people are asking about that as well. Again, it's called Unlock Your Epigenetics. And this is going to be a mind-blowing 6-week journey under Dr. Pelletier's expert guidance where you'll move beyond disease prediction models of DNA testing and discover how you can influence your gene expression to enjoy vibrant health. The 6-week course takes place on Wednesdays at noon Pacific, starting Wednesday, August 21st. And if you can't join us live, that's fine. You won't miss the teachings. You'll receive audio and video recordings, transcripts, and all course handouts on your course homepage. Also, if it takes you a little while to get your results back, that's fine too. You can always go back and re-listen to the recordings and help figure out what your results say. Also, I want to remind everyone that the Shift Network offers a no-risk money-back guarantee on all of our courses, giving you a full 2 weeks until September 4th in this case to make sure that you absolutely love it. And as an added option, all participants are welcome to connect in a private Facebook community group so you can stay connected with one another. Also, everyone who registers receives the Unlock Your Epigenetics bonus collection. First, you'll receive a video dialogue with Dr. Ken Pelletier and Dr. Emmeron Mayer entitled The Mind-Gut Connection. And next, you'll get a video dialogue with Ken and Dr. Robert Roundtree called Working with the Microbiome to Enhance Your Health. You'll also receive a PDF article from Ken and Dr. Roundtree entitled Healing with the Mind. And then you'll get a set of 3 PDF articles by Dr. Pelletier called Epigenetic Effect, a medley of articles. And you'll also receive a 50% discount on the assay test from day 2, which is pretty good. Plus, when you register by midnight Pacific on Wednesday, August 14th, you'll receive an extra gift, and that is a video dialogue with Ken called Change Your Genes, Change Your Life, based on his book. So before we get back into the viewers' questions, Ken, let me ask you, what are you most looking forward to sharing in your upcoming course?
Oh, well, I think my purpose in writing the book was to really convey to anyone with an interest in genetics and in their personal health an easy journey. I mean, I had to learn epigenetics over the last 7 or 8 years. When I was in medical school, it was Watson and Crick, DNA to RNA replication, end of lecture on genetics. So I had to relearn a lot of this information, and it was really brought to my attention by medical directors from a corporate program that I run, which is really my main area of research, and working with 15 of the Fortune 500 companies like Ford, Dow, Lockheed Martin, Oracle, Apple, American Airlines. They were asking, their executives were saying, should we include epigenetic testing in our annual profile? And they said, what do we do? And I said, I don't know. I have no idea. And started down the road of really learning. So the book and the course is really my attempt to convey to anyone in simple, clear, what's in it for me, useful information based on the best possible science, how we can attain optimal health and optimal longevity. So that's my hope. For the book, it's my hope for the course, and it's really my motivation for wanting to do this. Oh, yeah.
Sounds excellent. Wonderful. I'm glad you're doing it. Let's go ahead and get back into questions here. Those of you who are following the Shift Network know that I'm really into ancestral healing and epigenetics, etc. So this question here from Imelda really piques my interest too. She says, genes adapt and mutate in environment and nature, plus other factors, diet, stress, relationships, natural and man-made disasters. Are these inheritable traits passed from individuals to children? What about actually inheriting trauma, that type of thing?
That's a great question. There are several lines of research that, a short answer is yes. The genetic changes you make in your lifetime will be transmitted to your children. That's unequivocal. So if you think of people say, well, I had a hard time quitting smoking until I realized I wanted to be around to see my grandchild, or I didn't want to affect my family. So your reason for making these changes in your life, your lifestyle and life expectancy may not be for yourself, but it may be for your family, for your children, for your spouse. So that's a real motivator, because they will transmit. They are stable over time, and they will transmit from one generation to the next. Now, the positives. On the negative side, there are a couple of interesting areas of research. The first place where this interesting phenomenon called transgenerational epigenetics, it's kind of a mouthful, but it means genetic factors that skip a generation. It's kind of interesting. Was first noticed with the survivors of Nazi concentration camps. The assumption was that they would have a hyperreactive stress response, genetically predisposed because in their children, because of the extreme trauma they had by being in a concentration camp. So they looked at the children of concentration camp survivors, and they found that in fact, they did not have a heightened stress arousal. The genetic predisposition was there, but it didn't manifest. So they thought, that's interesting. Then they tested the grandchildren, so the children of their children, and they found the grandchildren did have a hyperarousal. And what they've speculated, no one really knows, quite honestly, but their speculation is that the survivors of the concentration camps were so concerned that their children not suffer, they helped them to not express and go through the kinds of early life trauma they experienced in a concentration camp, and therefore the predisposition to high stress response was not manifest in the children. Now, the children didn't have that same experience. They had a happy childhood, good life. So they didn't necessarily pass on those coping skills to their children. So the grandchildren inherited the high predisposition to excessive stress arousal, but didn't have the coping skills. And lo and behold, it showed up in that generation. Kind of fascinating. There's another study that actually came out after my book was published. That one, the study I just talked about, is in my book. There's another study that came out looking at obesity in Ireland. And what they looked at is, did the obesity of grandparents, or I'm sorry, yes, obesity of grandparents predict obesity in their children? The answer to that turned out to be no, it didn't. But then they looked at the grandchildren, and it turned out that the maternal grandmother, so the mother's mother, maternal grandmother's obesity predicted obesity in the female grandchild. It did not predict for the paternal line or for the boys, but it did. So the grandmother's overweight predisposition did not affect her daughter, but it affected her granddaughter. So these are some of these kind of head scratching. How does this happen? What does it mean? But what it does show is genes do inherit from one generation to the next. That's very clear. But they can also skip a generation. And how that happens, why that happens, those are the questions that make this really a fascinating field.
Yeah, there went the back of my head. Gone. It's just gone. I can't wait for this course so we can just talk about this for 6 weeks straight. In the meantime, though, let's get back to our viewers' questions. This question is about the course itself. This is Andrea. This is a little long, so give me a second to read it. Andrea says, in the course description, it says that in Module 4, Dr. Pelletier will walk us through the results of our epigenetic test. I imagine that hundreds of people will sign up for this course, and surely there will not be enough time to address everyone's results. So, will Dr. Pelletier pick a few as examples, or will he discuss results in general? So basically, just can you tell us a little bit about how that's going to work in the course?
Yeah, that's actually a very good question. Actually, in week 4, what I'm going to do is I'm going to invite one of the people from day 2 who really knows the testing, really knows the assay, its development, the publications, and they're going to be primarily responsible for presenting what is it, what's the day 2 assay, what are the dimensions of it, what will you expect, how do you administer it, when you know, all of the details, if you will, about the assay itself, and a lot of information about what it shows and what the ranges are, and give a lot of information. So that's then the second, actually it's week 5, where we'll take the general orientation that people will get. So you'll really understand, what is this assay all about, and what do I need to start thinking about in terms of questions. So then week 5, what we'll do is we'll go through each of the biomarkers, and in some cases we may be able to get down to an individual level, but in every instance what we'll do is we'll talk about, example, like inflammation. We'll say, here is the inflammatory markers in the general day 2 responses. And we'll have a group, by the way, we'll have a group, or I will have a group profile. So I'll know what the inflammation responses looks like in the group as a whole. So I'll say, you know, for those people who are too high, here are foods that you can bring it in. And you'll be looking at your own assay, and you'll see exactly where your number is. So you may be high, you may be low, you may be right in the middle, but when we're talking about it, you'll have your own information as a reference point. You'll know exactly what it means for you, even though we're not necessarily going to talk about you as an individual. The other part that I think is important about individual is that each of the day 2 assays includes one or actually an unlimited number, which is interesting, of consults with a nutritionist trained by day 2 in interpreting their assays. This is one of the other reasons why I chose them. So you'll get your assay back. You'll go through our interpretation and general overviews. Then you'll get a session. I think it's about 15 minutes to a half-hour session with a nutritionist that will really help you tweak and understand exactly what to do, like eat walnuts, not almonds, as an example. And I actually asked day 2, it rather surprised me. I said, well, how many consults are available? I said, there's no limit. And I thought, well, that's a terrible business model. You have an assay that people pay for, but then you give away consults. And they said, well, on average, over 10 years, they found that 1 or 2 consults is all they ever get. Because people learn, they hunker down, they start making changes, they might check back, but they found that 1 or 2 consults are all that are required, and they're very happy with that. They think it's really a great customer service. I do too. It's one of the reasons I thought of them as providing a good profile. So we'll do this in 2 parts in the course. Then there's the individual consultation, which can take place once or twice or as many times as you need based on your profile to make it really individualized for you.
Okay, perfect. We are about out of time, but I'm getting a lot of questions from people. They apparently missed the beginning of our conversation where we talked about whether this course in DNA testing can help with conditions that they already have. So can you just give just a real quick recap on how this can work to help people who already have conditions?
Sure. I mean, most people already have 1 or more chronic conditions. The course is designed to really optimize health to prevent the progression of chronic conditions. But even if you have one, the point is the sooner that you can discover what the predisposing factors are, what the biomarkers are, that you can learn to influence them. Now, you may not be able to reverse or have the condition go into remission, but you can slow its progression. You can improve your way of coping with it. You can decrease your symptoms. And this can occur at any age. The sooner that you detect these biomarkers and begin to do things to move them in a positive direction, the better. If you discover them at 40, it's obviously easier and better than, say, at age 70. But at any age, with any biomarker, with any chronic condition, you can have a major positive impact on that condition.
Beautiful. Thank you for repeating that. And wow, we are out of time. This has been just a great hour, great conversation. I want to thank our viewers for being with us today and for all of your great questions, because that's what we make these conversations out of. Thank you for all your input. Once again, Unlock Your Epigenetics starts Wednesday, August 21st. And again, you can visit unlockyourepigenetics.com to learn more and to register. So before we cut you loose, Ken, do you have any final words for our viewers?
Well, again, my hope is that what someone derives from the course is really a way to find their own optimal health and to extend their health and life expectancy as much as their genes will allow and as much as they can influence. So that's the outcome I hope for, and we can do it.
All right. Well, once again, thank you again, Dr. Ken Pelletier. It's been such a pleasure speaking with you today. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
And once again, thank you to everyone who joined us today. On behalf of all of us at the Shift Network, I wish you well and look forward to having you on this course or perhaps another one in the future. Have a great day, everyone.